Welcome to the introductory class to Basar B'chalav. This class is meant to be the initial offering of explaining how the learning is going to be structured and also to understand the processes of halakha, how they work, how we get from the original source material to some of the Shulchan Aruch material that we will be reviewing. So let's begin with how the class is structured. This class is going to start at the Shulchan Aruch. It's going to start with Yoredeya, and it's going to try Siman 87, that's chapter, but it's called a Siman in Hebrew, and with Seif Aleph. So we're going to begin with the laws of Basar B'chalav, and so we're going to use the structure of the Shulchan Aruch. However, the focus of the class will be to go through source materials all the way back to the Torah itself, and then go through materials post-dating the Shulchan Aruch. But we're going to use the formatting of the halakha and the Shulchan Aruch to give ourselves an understanding of how we're going to build out the halakha. So let's understand how the Shulchan Aruch got built. Let's start at the beginning. Hashem gives the Torah to the Jewish people. They're standing at Sinai. They accept the Torah as binding upon themselves and all the rules in there. One of those rules is Basar B'chalav. It's not really titled the laws of Basar B'chalav. We just accept something in the Torah that says Lo Tavashel Gedi B'chalev Imo. We accept that there's an understanding of that refers to Basar, meat, and Chalav, milk. So the actual translation is to not cook a baby goat in the milk of its mother. So that's the thing that's prohibited, and it's mentioned several times in the Torah. I don't want to spoil how many times, because that's going to be the initial class. But just know that it's mentioned several times. And so the original pasuk is what gives us that actual restriction. The question is, as time goes by and as people develop and things change, it's not always so simple how to define what that looks like. So initially, when the Torah is given to say don't cook milk and meat, right? Because we know this is probably meat and we know this is probably milk. But at some point in our history, between the giving of the Torah and the codification of the Mishnah, there was a lot of oral development about how this applied. When the Torah says basar, what kind of meat does it mean? When the Torah says chalav, what kind of milk does it mean? So that kind of information gets debated and then disseminated through the generations until we get the time of Rebbe and the Mishnahs organized. So Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, who is the organizer of the Mishnah, takes a lot of that initial information that he receives from sages that came before him, and he puts them in the Mishnah. So one such issue that's debated is what's the Torah prohibiting. So one thing that we'll talk about is that it's talking about cooking. Does cooking just mean in a pot? Does cooking mean if I throw it over a fire? Does cooking mean if I dunk it in hot springs? So all of these things get debated in the Mishnah and in the Talmud. So the original source material we'll try to understand what that means and how it's explained by the rabbis of the Talmud, Chazal, which is short for Chachamim Zichronam Livracha, the rabbis of the Talmud and the Mishnah. And we're going to look at how that original source material is understood to explain, number one, what the Torah was prohibiting to us. Number two is going to try to understand what the rabbis prohibited to us. So once we learn that you're not allowed to cook these things together, and all the other things the Torah prohibits as a result of that law, we're then going to look at the rabbinic requirements that are added by the rabbis, and they're very clear about the rabbinic restrictions, such as not having the milk and meat touching each other, such as that you should wait between meals, and if you're waiting between meals, what does it mean to wait? You don't have to wait, or you have to clean up. How long do you wait? And when we say you can't have milk and meat, does that just mean they can't be in the same pot on the same day? Could it be on different days? Could it be never together? And you'll probably have some ideas on your own about what this should look like, but we're going to look at the source material up to the Shulchan Aruch. Now, I'm jumping a little bit ahead. Because even though all those laws got to the Talmud was further explained by the group we refer to as the Rishonim, or rabbis in the medieval period. Basically, from the times, there's a time period known as the Gaonim, which doesn't impact everyone as much, but there's a time period known as the Gaonim, which is the time period after the conclusion of the Talmud, and the beginning of what's known as the period of the Rishonim. The Gaonim specifically are the rabbis who lived in Babylonia and were the heads of the yeshivas, Surah and Pampadisa, and they continued until about the 9th, 10th centuries. But the main thing is the Rishonim. The Rishonim got to look at all of that material, and they explained the laws in the way they understood them. Meaning that the laws that we now are familiar, with which we are now familiar, many of them developed in the period of the medieval rabbis. So that law, in that time period, debated amongst a number of scholars. Famously Rashi, who is a commentary on the Talmud. You have Tosfos, which is a number of rabbis in and around France and Germany, sometimes even England, if the Jews were still living there at the time. And they collected all of the European Jewry's information and collected it into a work known as Tosfos. There's also other works that collect major rabbis. There's the Mordechai, there's the Rosh, and then there's the Rif as well, who is from Sephardic lands, and the Rambam, who also is from Sephardic lands. So you had them at the time period in between times of the Gaonim and when the Tur lives. So the Tur is a very, very important work, because the Tur is the next major step in the development of halakha. Because the Rambam wrote a book codifying the entire Talmud, but he didn't leave sources, and therefore a lot of people didn't understand it, and even furthermore, people disagreed. But the Rambam's work did push along the work of halakha. However, it's considered not a final decision in halakha, but one of many decisions in halakha. So after the expulsion from Spain, a lot of Jews had been pushed into new areas, new communities, and there was basically a big push to try to normalize a lot of these opinions. So in Sfas, in the 16th century, there was a very famous rabbi named Rabbi Yosef Karo, who himself was expelled from Spain at the age of 3 years old. So he himself was one of the Grushay Sfarad, and he lands eventually in Sfas. His family goes to Turkey first, and then they end up in Sfas, in northern Israel. And there's a large number of rabbis who live there. And he sets out to write a commentary on the Arbiturim. So the Arbiturim has set out to organize the first one to organize the 4 big pillars that will eventually become the Shulchan Aruch. So Rabbeinu Asher's son, Rabbeinu Yaakov, as you know him as Rabbeinu Yaakov ben Aruch, puts together this fantastic work of 4 major categories of Jewish law that they want to codify for the Jewish world. He breaks it into Orach Chaim, which are basically prayers and holiday services, Yoredeya, which is like kashrus, bris milah, mezuzah, things that you do around the home, Even HaEzer, things related to family law, and Choshen Mishpat, things related to basically any type of civil law. There's some rules in there about criminal law, but there really isn't criminal law at that time period. Most of it's related to civil law and protecting civil law. Anyway, not to dwell on that. The Beis Yosef decides he wants to retain that work, the Tur, and write a long commentary on it. In his introduction, Beis Yosef says, I need to solve the problem of not resolving halakha. Here's how I'm going to solve it. I'm going to make a virtual Beis Din. The Beis Din is going to consist of, and these people have already long since passed. He lives in the 1500s, Rav Yosef Karo, and the people for whom he's writing lived in the 9th and 10th, 11th, and 14th centuries. He's got to take the Rambam, right? So the Rambam's work, the Mishnah Torah. He's going to take the work of the Rif. He's going to take the work of the Rosh. And amongst those 3, he's going to say, okay, well, the halacha between the 3 of them should be this way. So why is his commentary so long? Because he felt that once you go and explain the halakha from the very original source all the way to his time period, you'll see that there's like a convergence of thought. And so hopefully the majority of decisors will agree a certain way. But if they don't, I'm going to write them as what we call a yesh omrim. And he develops certain certain patterns that are meant to help people remember the halakha. So he writes a long work called the Beis Yosef, and he explains the halakha from its original sources in the Torah and the Talmud, all the way through the Rishonim until his day. And he explains these are the people who agree with the majority opinion, and these are people who disagree. And so, if an opinion seems to fit somewhat with the minority opinion, he'll write them in there as well. The Ramah, however, who lived in the exact same time period, was writing a similar book called Darchei Moshe. And then he finds out, after he gets through one of his volumes, he goes, I find out that there's another rabbi, Yosef Karo, wrote a similar book called the Beis Yosef. And he wrote another book called the Shulchan Aruch. So he said, I'm gonna write a little bit on the Beis Yosef. I'm gonna write a lot on the Shulchan Aruch, because we don't do halakha the same way. With us, it follows whoever the latest rabbis are, because they've seen the whole work of material before them, and we're gonna make a decision based on our customs here in Ashkenazi country. So he was writing for sort of what's now modern day Czechoslovakia, northern Italy, southern Germany. Southern France, Spain had already emptied out. The Jews hadn't even returned to England yet. So he's referring to a very, the Jews were concentrated in sort of those areas near southern Germany, Hungary, Austria, those areas at the time. So there was a difference of opinion, and they're recorded in that work. So we start with that work where the two opinions of how to decide halakha meet with each other. There's the way the Beis Yosef decided, and the way that the Ramah decided. So we're going to work all the way through all that material to get to the Shulchan Aruch. Great. We're then going to look at how people took all that information. We're going to go from basically the mid 15th century to today to look at how a number of decisors have looked at that material and made decisions in more modern times. Because what everybody seems to agree on is that if everyone has agreed with the conclusions of the Ramah and the Beis Yosef, of one or the other or both, then that's going to be the final halakha. You can't veer from it. However, sometimes you will find that the later authorities point out that there was a mistake made in understanding the halakha, either going back to the Beis Yosef himself, or even to the fact that the Tur got it right, and everyone else had been making mistakes since that time. And there are basically 3 or 4 major schools of thought on that. So there's the one school of thought, which is like the Sefer Mir Sinayim, Prisha V'Drisha, that's written by Shul Katz. There's the Taz, and then there's the Bach. They are like one school of thought, and they are one way in which they learn halakha. Then there's another group in Yoredea, at least which we're going to focus on, that follows the opinion of the Shach, which is basically very similar to the sort of the Lithuanian school of thought that pervades the versions of the Shulchan Aruch that many of us are familiar. It's to go ahead and make sure that everybody properly learned the source material, and that the source material was presented accurately and authentically, and that the Shulchan Aruch is authentic, and then we will either build off of that, or we'll point out where the mistakes have been made along the way. And that school of thought is pretty much the way that a lot of the commentaries act on a standard Shulchan Aruch page. You'll see a lot of Lithuanian influences in there. So you'll see like the Baragola, who cites the original source of the Shulchan Aruch, and then the major debates that we'll get will be between the Shach and the Taz on the page. We'll also talk about the Bach a lot. Those will be the biggest ones. Well, there's also the Vilna Gaon, who sometimes will say, if you really look deep enough, you see the halacha is exactly like this source here that everyone misinterprets. Or he says, or everything's pretty clear because it follows this source material. 9 times out of 10, it's the second way. And then there's the Pischei Tshuva, who brings down modern sources who debate the material and sort of explain how it was applied. Sometimes some people will completely disagree with it altogether, but we'll see that. But you'll see that halacha kind of follows that trend. There's another side of it where you see a little bit slight break between the Ashkenazi and the Sephardic traditions, in terms of the Sephardic traditions tend to not break from the conclusions of the Beit Yosef, and the Ashkenazi opinions tend to not break from the opinions of the Ramah. So you start to see that break specifically in the commentaries and in the Pischei Tshuva. We will try to cover as many commentaries to cover the different approaches of Sfarad and Ashkenaz, because we have a broad audience. And so we'll try to explain how the different approaches worked, and to see if that was retained in the Sephardic tradition or the Ashkenazi tradition, depending on different approaches in the Shulchan Aruch. So I hope that kind of gives you an idea for how the class will be approached and how we are going to break down halakha. Let's go through a quick breakdown again of how the halakha will be decided as we go through our class. We're going to start with the Shulchan Aruch itself. We'll read through the Mechaber, Rav Yosef Karo's decision, and then the Ramah, the commentary or glosses of Rav Moshe Isserles. We will then hop back to the original source, either from the Torah itself, or from the Mishnah, or from the Talmud. And then we will build down through that, through the words of the Geonim, and the words of the Rishonim, through the rabbis who were the rabbis in Babylonia between the 6th and 9th centuries, or the Rishonim, who were the medieval rabbis mostly in medieval Europe in the 10th through 15th centuries. We will also, and by the way, that includes Sfarad, which was Spain at the time, and then we'll eventually migrate into some Middle Eastern lands as well, those influences. We will then take a look at the influences of the Tur on this halakha, how he brings it and codifies it in his work Arbiturim, and how he cites certain works of the Rishonim. We'll then take a look at the Beis Yosef and the Darchei Moshe to see how they incorporate the works of the rabbis that they feel are the most appropriate. So the Beis Yosef using his methodology of the virtual Beis Din, of the Rambam, the Rif, and the Rush, or Rav Moshe Isserles' way of going with the most recent in his time rabbinic decisors. And then after that, once we understand sort of the background of that Shulchan Aruch, we'll then go into the later commentaries on it and look at the different schools of thought and how they come out to more modern decisions, to see if they completely agree with the train of thought that's preceded them, if they have a disagreement, if they feel it applies differently, and so on and so forth. But the goal is to show how there's a very specific developmental project that goes on through halakha, and that everyone's kind of working together in a very similar way. It may feel like that there's a huge divergence, but the goal is to kind of see that there's not really massive divergencies in the way that these laws are applied, and just to appreciate the different ways in which they come out to some modern practice. So I look forward to learning the halakha with everyone who's in this class. I look forward to spending time with you and interacting with you and learning the material. And I hope you go ahead and learn through some of this material on your own, so that way when you are watching these classes, you'll be more familiar with the material and gain as much from it as I did, both intellectually and also spiritually, because it's good to know that not only did we receive the Torah, but we've taken centuries to really understand what it really means to us and how to best apply it to our lives.